I think the Israelite exile in Egypt, in which you find in early Exodus, contains some interesting insights into the nature of the Gentile soul. You can see this through Pharaoh and his three advisors, those being Bilaam, Job, and Jethro, and others that are in the background. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly so that the land was filled with them. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, some say that this wasn't a new king, but that this same king pretended not to know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal wisely with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pitom, and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks, with all sorts of tasks in the field. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shifra and the other Pua. Now, when you're looking around at these verses, this one on the Hebrew midwives, you'll notice that verses in Job are related. It says here, this text, speaking of our verse here, is related to Job, and then that repeats multiple times. And then, if you keep looking through the Midrash, Job actually does show up. Very interesting. So there's hints of Job here, and you'll see why this is significant very soon. Because Job was one of Pharaoh's three advisors. And who wrote the books of the Bible? Moses wrote his own book, being the Torah, and the portion of Bilaam in the Torah, which is Numbers 24 and 23, I believe, as well, and the book of Job. Interestingly, so Moses wrote Job and the portion of Bilaam. Interestingly, of course, Job and Bilaam are two of three advisors to Pharaoh. And it says here, three were associates in that council. They are Bilaam, Job, and Jethro, or Yitro. Bilaam, who advised to drown the newborn males, was killed. Job, who was silent and was reluctant to express his opinion, was sentenced to suffer afflictions. And Yitro, who fled after he disagreed with that council and Pharaoh sought to kill him, his descendants were privileged to sit as scribes in session with the Sanhedrin in the chamber of hewn stone. And then it goes over some verses that have been quoted on this channel many, many, many times, having to do with the Cainites. Three noteworthy people were consulted by Pharaoh in that council, where Pharaoh questioned what should be done with the Jewish people. They were Bilaam and Job and Jethro. You can see these are three levels of Gentiles, and four if you include Pharaoh. And then there is an argument that some say that Job was a Jew, others say that he was a Gentile. 7 prophets prophesied to the nations of the world, and they are Bilaam and his father Beor, and Job, Eliphaz, which is a name found in Job, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Namathite, and Elihu ben Barachel the Buzite, which indicates that Job was not Jewish. There are some other hints that he probably wasn't a Jew either. Like, no one ever mentions this, but in Gematria, if you take Iyov or Job, has the same value as goy, as the word goy, which often does mean a non-Jew. And then they carry on the argument. The latter years of Israel's bondage in Egypt were the worst. To punish Pharaoh for his cruelty towards the children of Israel, God afflicted him with a plague of leprosy, which covered his whole body from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. Instead of being chastened by his disease, Pharaoh remained stiff-necked, and he tried to restore his health by murdering Israelite children. He took counsel with 3 advisors, Balaam, Jethro, and Job, how he might be healed of the awful malady that had seized upon him. Balaam spoke, saying, You can regain your health only if you will slaughter Israelite children and bathe in their blood. Jethro, averse from having a share in such an atrocity, left the king and fled to Midian. It's interesting that Moses also flees Egypt to Midian. And who does he live with there? Jethro. Job, on the other hand, though he also disapproved of Balaam's counsel, kept silent and in no way protested against it. Wherefore God punished him with a year's suffering. He also may have had the same disease that Pharaoh had. But afterward, he loaded him with all types of luxuries in life. So we know that Job was extremely wealthy before he lost everything and was afflicted. And then afterwards, he was granted many years and all of his wealth restored and also doubled, so that this pious Gentile might be rewarded in this world for his good deeds and not have the right to urge a claim upon the beatitude of the future life, which means a life in the world to come. So all of his merits were rewarded in this world. It's interesting about this. We know that Job was 70, and he's afflicted, and then God afterwards not only doubles his wealth, but he doubles his years. So 70 plus 140 equals 210, which is the exact amount of years that the Israelites were in Egypt. That's the exact amount of years of the Egyptian exile. And here's a note why the Israelite women were not persecuted. There were 3 advisors with Pharaoh, with whom Pharaoh consulted regarding the Israelites. They were Jethro, Balaam, and Job. Why did these 3 men hate the people of Israel? They were jealous. Jethro was a descendant of the Midianites, who were the offspring of Abraham's relationship with Keturah. He was jealous because Moses gave all his holiness and possessions to Isaac and sent the descendants of Keturah away, back in early Genesis. Similarly, Balaam was a descendant of Lavan, who hated Isaac because he married his sister Rebekah. He felt that by doing this, Isaac robbed him of the potential greatness he would have had, since Rebekah took away all the divine sparks. And finally, Job married Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and was extremely jealous because the sons inherited from their father, and Dinah was completely disinherited. Interesting. So Yitro refused to participate in the persecution, so he ran away. Job advised oppressing the male children since he was jealous of the tribes, while Balaam advised oppressing and killing the female children since he was angry at his sister as well as his 2 daughters who married Jacob and deprived him of the divine sparks. Balaam was not powerful enough to convince Pharaoh against the advice of Job, so in Egypt the male children were oppressed by Pharaoh and not the female children. This was the advice of Bilaam, who was among the 3 advisors to Pharaoh. He suggested that Pharaoh cause the Israelites to sin by making them worship false gods. Later, Balaam gave the same advice to the Moabites in the wilderness in order to destroy the Israelites after he failed to curse them. By causing them to sin, he would prevent the divine sparks from rising out of Egypt and later Moab. Wisdom is associated with the fear of God. Dealing wisely with the Israelites, then, meant destroying their fear of God. 3 advised Pharaoh, Balaam, Job, and Jethro. Balaam advised him to destroy them. Yet after he saw them go out of Egypt and God performing miracles for them, he feared cursing them by himself and waited expectantly for a nation to send for him. And that gave him an excuse to ask of God. Also, this is the 9th verse in the Parsha. Very interesting here. I'd never heard this before. And every time the 9th verse appears in a Parsha, in the Torah portion, it contains an intention far deeper than it would seem at first glance according to its plain meaning. Once Pharaoh began to worry about the Israelites' intentions, he began to think about how to convince the rest of Egypt to go along with him. He knew that the Egyptians had fond memories of Joseph and were not likely to turn against the Israelites. Therefore, he began by implanting paranoia in the hearts of the people. He told them that the Israelites were planning a rebellion and that they would soon take all the wealth out of Egypt that Joseph had amassed. Only then did the Egyptians agree to oppress the Israelites, when they began thinking about the Israelites' great wealth and how they could steal it. He also declared war on the Edomites, the children of Esau, forcing the Israelites to go along to help in the battle. And at the last minute, the Egyptians withdrew, leaving the Israelites to fight with the Edomites alone. This upset the Israelites greatly, and some Egyptians were killed in retaliation, thus turning the Egyptians against the Israelites. It was only then that the advisors of Pharaoh, or advisors of Egypt, gathered together, and Pharaoh said, "Let us deal wisely with them." It's a lot of backstory here that I wasn't aware of. Concerning Moses' additional argument that he was not suitable for the appointment to lead the people, saying, "I am slow of speech and slow of tongue," meaning he wasn't a great speaker. He wasn't the most charismatic speaker. We have been told on the verse that while growing up in Pharaoh's palace, Moses once took the king's crown and threw it on the ground. The king wanted to execute him on account of this misdemeanor. His astrologers used this incident to point out that Moses must be the boy of whom they had been warned that he would become the redeemer of the Israelites. According to Shemot Rabbah, Pharaoh consulted with his closest advisors, who included Balaam, Yitro, and Job. They offered different advice, one saying that the boy was guilty of death, the other saying that it was a youthful prank not to be taken seriously. They advised a means to test if there had been an evil intent in Moses knocking off his foster grandfather's crown. They placed before him a bowl containing both a golden coin and a glowing coal. If Moses were to grab for the coal, this would prove that he had not had any evil intention. If he were to grab for the golden coin, this would be a sign that he was dangerous and he would have to be killed. Moses was about to grab the golden coin when an angel pushed his hand toward the coal, and he burned his tongue when trying to taste it. According to this midrash, this is where Moses' stammer came from, or his lack of ability to speak perfectly. My father was a wandering Arami, or Aramaic, who descended to Egypt. That the meaning is that Bilaam and Lavan were identical, or meaning that one was the reincarnation of the other. Now, I've heard that Lavan was actually Beor, Bilaam's father, but I've never heard this reincarnation thing. It means that because of the two wrongs committed by Lavan, Jacob, or the Jewish people, wound up in exile in Egypt. The two wrongs were that at first Lavan tried to destroy Jacob and his family, Later, having moved to Egypt, he became an advisor to Pharaoh, advising him on how to harm the Jewish people. Sanhedrin there explains, talking about the Talmud, that Pharaoh had three such advisors, which we know who they are. Bilaam was the one who advised killing Moses outright as a baby, since one could not be sure he would not be the savior of the Jews, and this is spelled out. From all the foregoing, we see that the entire family of Jacob originated with Bilaam, the latter having been Lavan, the father of all of Jacob's wives. Very interesting. People often don't consider these types of things. Like, they'll just say, oh, this person is evil, but they never tend to think of, like, what came of it. This lineage was reinforced further through Balak, who as king of Moab, was also the ancestor of Ruth, who became the great-grandmother of King David, who embodies everything that Israel is proud of and looks up to, including the Messiah. We have to remember that Moab and Ammon, they come from Lot, and, everybody knows the story. But from that incident, we get to the Messiah. Now I'll give you some advice. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there were three people involved in this advice. They were Balaam, Job, and Jethro. Job, who kept silent, was punished for not objecting with the afflictions described in the book of Job. So this was a punishment. His afflictions were a punishment because of not standing up for what is right and just knowing that it's wrong but not doing anything about it. Jethro, who left the discussion in disgust, was rewarded by his descendants becoming seated in the offices near the Temple of Solomon. Bilaam was killed by the sword in the campaign against Midian. And then they again show the greatness of Jethro's descendants. Now this is very interesting. This is where you can find Jethro's name cleverly hidden in the book of Job. This is the meaning of this verse in Job 30:11. For the Lord has humbled me. In this version, the word here you can see. I'm not exactly sure how to say it, so I'm not going to say it. But you can see here's Jethro, Yitro. And in the text, you see it here with a vav with a yud at the end instead of a vav. And this is what they say. I noticed that years and years ago, but could never prove that it was a reference to Jethro. And here it confirms it for me, and saying that this is a reference to Moses' father-in-law, who had been present when Pharaoh consulted with his advisors on how to deal with what he considered the danger of the multiplying Hebrews. Supposedly, he was the first to respond to Pharaoh's question. This is difficult as Job never fled. So how can we interpret the beginning of that verse in Job as applying to Jethro? We may have to answer that at that time, Jethro was the most respected personage, so his opinion mattered the most, and he could have protested Pharaoh's murderous intentions, but instead he was content to simply flee Pharaoh's presence. This is why the verse quoted Job accuses him of having failed. So Job thinks that, according to Job, Jethro failed, but, in the end, he converted to at least monotheism. Maybe he was present at Sinai. No one's really sure. But here is the verse in question. Because God has disarmed me and humbled me. And here you see Jethro's name. But this is how it is supposed to be said.